because, you know, increasingly I see that not a single venue in Tasmania would agree to host the launch for the traditional marriage view in Tasmania. Not one. And of course we know that when we had Bjorn Lomborg wished to establish a centre, who was a sort of Scandinavian who believes in man-made global warming, but believes we should actually test the cost and benefits of different approaches to its management. And that proposition was so offensive and so heretical that not 1 out of 40 Australian universities would agree to host the Lomborg Centre. Because, of course, the one thing we must never do is ask what is the relationship between cost and benefit on spending to reduce the temperature of the Earth. And look, I am just absolutely thrilled to be here tonight. I would have paid, you know, if I was required to. But since, you know, could give me the opportunity for nothing, obviously I'm going to say yes. I feel like the groupie who has been invited to introduce the band. And there's a guy named Jack Donovan who wrote a book where he studied what is the primal conception of masculinity that males admire in other males. And he said, now, trigger warning, I don't want to offend anybody here. You know, I'm going to talk about some ancient virtues here. So, you know, there is a sort of a counselling area up the back for any Sydney Morning Herald journalists who might be present. Do we have anyone from the Herald? No.
It wasn't game.
It wasn't game to come, no. I think they're all off on training for the new ergonomic chairs that they've just all, you know, that's the top priority there at Fairfax. But Donovan argues that, he says, you know, we can have an argument about it, but he says the 4 things that men admire most in other men is firstly is strength. Secondly is mastery of your field. The third was, I think, loyalty, and the fourth, I think, was honour. But courage. Now, the thing I want to say is I spend more time kind of looking at studying, for example, politics. Politics becomes, you know, in the modern Australian context, one of the less interesting subjects on the menu, regrettably. Politics is something you study in effect as a chore because you have to if you're, you know, some kind of decent citizen or if you aspire to be one. But the thing that courage for me is now the number one thing that I look for in a political aspirant. Because we are living in an increasingly oppressive regime. The fact that there is a question about whether it is possible to procure a venue to express a lawful opinion in this country tells you that Australia is in deep trouble. And the levels of oppression, I feel like living in a city like Sydney is like having a, you know, you go on Nat Geo and you can watch a boa constrictor wrapped around a goat. I feel like the goat. The level of pressure to conform to orthodox opinion is so intense Mark Latham launched a book today. It's so encouraging for me to go from a book launch from Mark Latham at lunchtime to one from Ian Plimer at the evening. I feel like, you know, I'm in a Perisher and we've just had a foot dump of fresh powder outside. But I'm going to have a crack at a couple of people tonight, not because I wish to. Can I tell you, I'm like the most peace-loving soul on this planet. You know, nothing would give me greater pleasure than to retire to obscurity and study the Greek and Roman philosophers. That is what I would most like to do. But I find as a pure act of duty, it is necessary for me and for you being here tonight as citizens of a once great constitutional democracy to turn up and defy a few bullies. I want to say that the first person I would like to send this book to is Andrew Mackenzie, the global CEO of BHP Billiton. And BHP, of course, were the ones who, you know, a few days ago decided to announce in the middle of Minerals Week that BHP was going to distance itself from the Minerals Council in relation to the question of extracting coal. I think Andrew Mackenzie's current goal is a 50-50 gender split in one of the world's largest mining corporations. Andrew Mackenzie's only management question he ever asks these days is, are you going to do that with or without lubrication? Okay? That's the only question in his mind. Okay? He is a fully conformed integer of the deep state. Okay? There is no originality in his analysis whatsoever. He's simply, BHP Billiton is simply a corporation which seeks to look at the zeitgeist of prevailing daft left progressive ideas and hold up a perfect mirror. And, you know, what we see increasingly from corporate Australia, you know, I'm not going to name the person from you know, an eminent lawyer here from one of Sydney's great law firms. I mean, the legal profession wants this great source of ballast, cultural ballast, of independence, of confident, reason-based analysis. Now, you might, they're all run, every major partner of every major law firm is run by a 26-year-old graduate of UTS Media Studies, telling them about, you know, triple bottom line accounting, your social responsibilities. Now we have Sydney University. Sydney University has announced yesterday that their business school is teaching all of the undergraduates that they must unlearn business because the profit motive is no longer an acceptable basis for commercial interactions between unrelated citizens. So we have to go to Sydney University to unlearn business. Mark Latham calls this class the medieval grave diggers. And when you read, I will talk a little bit about, this is one of the reasons why I love Plimer.
No one else does.
It's not the case. It's not the case, mate. I feel like one of the Christians shivering in the catacombs as the Roman legions march across the top, and we're hiding in the shadows with the flicker of candlelights, and Plimer is like the Apostle Paul, you know. He is a weight-bearing integer in this argument. And he has both mastery of his field and the courage to express an opinion. Now that means he would not survive for 10 minutes in PricewaterhouseCoopers, for example, you know, or Deloitte's, right, or Accenture, where you must submit to absolute uniformity of opinion, right, if you want to get ahead. And one of the great scandals, I mean, if we want to have a Royal Commission into, banking, we should actually have a Royal Commission into those merit candidates for promotion in companies and businesses all across this country who have been denied the opportunity because they've been discriminated against on the basis of their skin colour or genitalia, which is a massive army of Australians. A couple of things about, the Plimer book, which I like. The book makes a number of absolutely compelling, and in my judgment, as somebody who wishes to respect reason, makes compelling arguments. Now, when I tweeted an invitation out to this event, I said, come to the Metropolitan Hotel, 6:30 Thursday, Ian Plimer's book launch with Ross Cameron. Somebody tweeted back, I can't believe they are giving that nutter any more airtime. So naturally I assumed they were referring to Ian. But I just want to say, I'm going to do something I don't usually do, which is I'm actually going to read you a little bit from Ian Plimer's bio, in case you weren't familiar with it. Now, this is not from Ian. This is from Wikipedia, who, as you know, basically hates rationality and coal. Ian Rutherford Plimer. Now, this goes to this ancient virtue of mastery. Ian Rutherford Plimer, born 12 February 1946.
That's wrong. Is that right? I have got it wrong by 8 months.
8 months?
So do not believe Wikipedia.
Okay. Is an Australian geologist, Professor Emeritus of Earth Sciences at the University of Melbourne, Professor of Mining Geology at the University of Adelaide, Director of multiple mineral exploration and mining companies, has published many scientific papers, 6 books, is one of the co-editors of the Encyclopedia of Geology. 1994, Plimer won the Daly Prize for Communication of Science from the Australian Museum. 1994, he won the Goldfields Prize for the best paper in the Institution of Mining and Metallurgy. 1995, the Eureka Prize for Promotion of Science from the Australian Museum. 95, Australian Humanist of the Year. 98, the Leopold von Buch Plaquette from the German Geological Society. 2001, the Centenary Medal. 2002, Eureka Prize for Best Science Book, A Short History of Planet Earth, the Australian Museum. In 2004, Plimer won the Clark Medal from the Royal Society. In 2005, he won the Rio Tinto Award for Mining Excellence. 2005, the Sir Willis Connolly Medal, the Australasian Institute of Mining and Metallurgy. In 2009, a new phosphate mineral, Plimerate, was named in honour of Plimer for his contributions to the geology of ore deposits, in particular the Broken Hill deposit. So what I want to know is, when are you going to get off your fat ass and do some work, mate? When are you going to do something with your life? The point that Ian makes in the book, okay, is that there is absolutely no proven link between the emission of carbon dioxide by humans and a rise in temperature. None whatsoever. There is not the first scrap of scientific evidence linking CO2 to higher temperatures. In fact, as the book shows, through a series of bits of raw data, which I just find, looking at it, well, we should get through the end of the first chapter and say, well, that's the end of the book. The argument is obviously over. And what Ian shows, for example, is that of the various ice ages that the Earth has suffered, which we can discern with a high level of accuracy from samples of ice in the Antarctic or the Arctic, we know that in previous times the level of carbon dioxide in the Earth has been much, much higher than it currently is. At times of previous ice ages, we've had the level of CO2 in the atmosphere over 100 times greater than it is right now, and we had an ice age. In fact, what we see, if there is any correlation between CO2 and temperature, it is the reverse of what is being alleged by the global warming alarmists. And we can see that there is simply, if there is no relationship between CO2 and temperature, there can be no causality. It's that simple. It's a very simple proposition. Even me, you non-scientists get the idea that if there's no correlation between CO2 and temperature, how can there be causation? And indeed, what Ian gets, which I 100% agree with, is that climate change is not about climate. In my opinion, any more than gay marriage is about marriage. The left progressive Bible was basically written by a guy in Chicago who wrote a book called Rules for Radicals. What's his name?
Saul Alinsky.
Saul Alinsky. This is the problem with the Jews. Okay, the Jews are my favourite people. All right, they are definitely my favourite people on the whole of the planet Earth. But when they go bad, they sometimes go really bad. And Saul Alinsky is such an example. But Saul says in the book, the Rules for Radicals, about 14 rules. In fact, 13, is it? One of the rules, about number 12, is 11, 12 something. He says, never, ever, ever let your enemy rest. Just when they are coming to grips with your latest monstrosity, launch a new monstrosity, on some other front. So just when we have agreed to entirely reorganise human society around the interest of the 3 in 10,000 who genuinely are not sure what their gender is, just when we've decided to do that, we should shut down every coal-fired power station in the world. Can I tell you, the book also touches on what I regard as the greatest weakness of the progressive argument on climate, which is that it's the humanitarian argument for coal. It is the moral argument for coal. And if you were to ask me to rank in order of evil, the most evil Australians, okay, I would be brave to do it, even here in the catacombs, to tell you what I really think. But I will tell you this, that in India today, there's over 1 billion people. According to the last Indian census, 50% of the Indian population has a flushing toilet in the home. Those who have no electricity no access to electricity whatsoever is at least 400 million people. Now, I want you to imagine what it is like, for example, as a mother of a newborn child, if you can't boil a kettle to heat, a bottle of milk, to clean a dirty nappy. And we find that Indians do have some access to coal. And Adam Bant, okay, whom, if I'm going to be frank, if I'm going to be honest, at the risk of offence, I think is evil. Because he is campaigning to ensure that 400 million Indians remain destitute. Indians do actually get access to coal. The way they get it is by climbing onto moving coal trains. And they climb up to, in India there is actually no real distinction between a rail freight train and a passenger train. Both the same thing. And what you see is that to get access to coal, Indians climb onto moving trains with buckets and their pockets, and they fill the bucket from the back of the train, and then they climb down off the moving train carrying a bucket of coal weighing several kilos and jump back down onto the ground and then walk back to their villages. And that is what Adam Bandt wants to continue. Much of India's coal is actually carried out of coal pits by men and women in baskets on their heads. And that is what Adam Bandt wishes to continue. I say, what is his name? Jeffrey Cousins, you know. Imagine dedicating your life as a rich, white Australian living in perfect comfort with temperature controlled every room in your house, campaigning to ensure that black people never get electricity. In the words of a great American singer-songwriter, you don't impress me much. Ian is belling the cat. Ian Plimer has got the stature, has got the ballast, has got the weight-bearing propensity to call this thing out. I will tell you one other thing I loved about the book.
Sorry, he voted his tummy.
Voted his tummy, yeah, he's not going, he's obviously not hungry. But he talks about how there is this fetishization in the progressive mind of new technology. That there is this belief that the world began with kind of Yoko Ono, you know, it was the beginning of history. And everything must be new. Everything must be new. So if it's old, it is by definition defective. And Plimer makes the point that the wheel was invented almost certainly around Sumeria, Mesopotamia, about 3,500 BC, originally used to lubricate a potter's wheel. That was the first time. It wasn't actually used for transport until at least about 300 years later, because actually the requirements of the straightness of the axle and the tightness of the joint with the wheel required a great deal of mastery of the principles of physics. And it took them 300 years before its invention. Now there's still lots and lots of places. The wheel massively drove forward human mobility, obviously, human prosperity. It was a fundamental to the Industrial Revolution. But the point that Ian makes is the wheel has not been, still, I look out the window, I can see 100 wheels within my eyesight. That's a technology which is 5,500 years old. And why are we still using the wheel? Because it hasn't been replaced by a better technology. So the fact that something is old is entirely immaterial. You know, if anything, it argues strongly in favour of its retention. And this, of course, to me, is what it means to be a conservative, is to have a reason-based approach to making decisions rather than a feeling-based approach. And if we were to go, Plimer talks in the book about the scientific method, about what a tremendous gift of enlightenment it was. When you think about how long the human species has been on this planet, you know, we can have an argument about it. There is obviously no sort of correct answer, but if a species is defined as a male and a female who are capable of reproduction, they belong to the same species if they can reproduce. So if you were to go back in history to the last of your ancestors whom you could have gone out on a date with, had a really good time, you know, connected, and actually created a new life. We don't know how far back that is, all right? But modern human species, some people say it's 2 million years old, some people say it's 300,000 years, whatever. But it's a long time. Let's say it's 2 million, that's 50,000 generations of humans that you are the product of. But it took us until 3,500 BC to discover the first wheel. We went from the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk in 1903, thank you sir. 1903, we went from the Wright brothers to one small step from man in effectively three generations. So these things are precious, you know, these things are important. And the last thing I will say before handing it over, if you look at what has taken place, for example, in China, it is that Chinese government deserves a Nobel Peace Prize, in my opinion. Deng Xiaoping probably is the one who deserved it, because the policies of the Chinese government lifted, Plimer says 700 million Chinese out of destitute poverty. Okay. Every kilometre of road built in China is built as a consequence of the coal-fired power required to forge concrete. This is a miracle. This is a humanitarian miracle. And the critical ingredient, the thing without which it could not have happened, was coal. Coal consumes much less land per megawatt hour of energy than solar, much less than anything except nuclear. And yet we find this boneheaded progressive dogma saying, no, we must litter the entire landscape with intensely toxic chemical-filled batteries and solar cells that have to be replaced when they're clapped out after, 7 or 8 years, because we have this religious hatred of coal. And so what we know is it's not about coal, it's not about climate. You should read the book if you wish to understand coal and climate. And I say, reading Plimer, like there are 118 elements in the periodic table. How many are there? Somebody will make a
stable, 118 stable plus unstable.
Okay, beautiful, there you go. Reading the book, it's as if the periodic table of elements has found its own voice. Plimer has managed to so study the Earth, that he sees it instinctively as a part of a greater solar system in a wider universe. As Marcus Aurelius said, you may understand the universe as a kind of constitutional state. It operates according to restraints which are incorporated largely, in the periodic table, in the principles of physics, in the first law of thermodynamics, and the second, that you cannot actually, the whole distinction between renewable and non-renewable. Long quote from Marcus Aurelius, you're putting me on the spot now. That's okay. But I will just say that Marcus saw himself as a part and challenged everyone to see themselves as a part, this massive abyss of time before we arrived and the vast abyss of time after we leave. Plimer says that the sun will continue to drive atmospheric climate on Earth long after humans are gone. So there is a sort of stoic, Roman element in it. Somebody else said to me I should stop quoting the Romans, I should quote the Greeks, because most of Roman philosophy is basically a rip-off from the Greeks. Since we're talking about an electricity rip-off, the very last point I will leave you with is if you only ever took one thing from Socrates, one thought, if he never did anything else, he only published one idea, Socrates came along to this intensely tribal species who had survived by centuries and millennia of tribal violence, who were hostage to, like much of the rest of the animal kingdom, to unbridled emotion, to payback, to furies and passions. And Socrates came along and he said, look, you may be guided by your emotion as the way to make a decision, but there is an alternative, and that is to be guided by your reason. And Socrates argued, Plato picked up the chords, that it is in our interests, and I'm not in a sense pitching this to you, who, let's agree, you are the choir, right? We're all converts here in the catacomb. But Socrates, to the unwashed, the response, climate change, the debate is over, okay? It's bullshit. That's the answer, okay? Man-made climate change is a crock of shit, okay? It has zero scientific or empirical respectability, but it is now locked into this hegemonic doctrine which is built entirely and replicated by feelings, by the way we feel. And Plimer's analysis of the scientific method and the role of reason, it is like it's like a Bible for the Western rational mind. I want to introduce you to one of my favourite and most admired Australians, Emeritus Professor Ian Plimer.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. At some occasions, and I never attend them, they have a welcome to country.
No.
Now my welcome is to the country Mesopotamia. Because without Mesopotamia, we wouldn't have this. And this is the drink of kings and high priests. You peasants here, my redder crowd in the front row, they drink wine. That is the drink of peasants. This is the country that we welcome. And from that part of the world, we started to acquire knowledge, astronomical knowledge, mathematical knowledge. And as Ross has spoken about, the Greeks. Now the Greeks gave us some very important things, one of which, as we heard, was reason, logic, and the basis of science. After that, the Romans gave us Justinian law. They wrote down law, which was very important. We then went through a stage of the Dark Ages. We came into a wonderful period of time. The Dark Ages, for some odd reason, it was very cold. And that wonderful period of time, when we had warmth in the medieval warming, when we had economies expand, was a natural warming. The rate of warming was far greater than anything we measure today. We had massive prosperity. And from that, we built our churches and cathedrals and monasteries and universities. The universities then were to train young men for the priesthood. They're certainly not now. And we then came out of that medieval warming and we came into a cool period called the Little Ice Age. It took 23 years to have a massive climate change. And during those times we had the Renaissance and we had the Reformation, and printing enabled us to be able to read pamphlets, to be able to be critical and analytical, because power and knowledge then was held by the church. And if we could read, and if we had printing, we could be critical and analytical. And that was the unstitching of the power of the church. Almost it was 499 years, 51 and a half weeks ago, we had a massive event happen. And that was the nailing of the 95 Theses onto the oak door of a church. And that was a theological argument. It wasn't meant to change the world, but it did. And so we had a period of enlightenment that appeared as a result of printing, as a result of people being critical, as a result of people having the freedom to actually criticise and to analyse. And then we came into a period where we had massive growth in the Industrial Revolution, and that was due to coal. And there are two genders of coal, one of which is coking coal, and the other of which is steaming coal. And coking coal is absolutely necessary to convert iron ore into steel. There is no other economical way of doing it. And that coal changed the world. That changed us in the Western world, where we had the peasants and we had the landowners. But people then went and worked in the cotton factories. They worked in the mines. They worked in the steelworks. And they then had that yoke from the land broken. And they were able to work. They were able to get paid. They were able to live in a house. They were able to take a holiday. And because they took a train to the seaside, and that was the time when England had 13 different time zones, they had to own a watch. And they had to be able to read a timetable. It was coal that brought us from being peasants into the middle class. And exactly the same thing now is happening in India. Exactly the same thing now is happening in China. And the moral question which I raised, which Ross commented on, is why should people in this very, very wealthy, comfortable Western country deny other people the opportunity which we've had? Now, our Western civilization has taken 2,500 years to get to where we are. And what is happening now is a total deconstruction of those 2,500 years. A little bit later, I will argue that the whole climate change hysteria has got nothing to do with climate. It's got nothing to do with the environment. It's deconstruction of Western civilization. Now, I quite often get accused of many things, and most of them are right. I do get accused of being a climate denier, whatever that is. And in this book I argue that maybe that isn't the case, because as a geologist we use the past to understand the present, and we're very wary about looking into the future. And there was a Thursday 4,567 million years ago when this planet formed, and very soon after something large hit us and sliced off a bit of our planet, and that bit we now call the moon. And this very early period of planet Earth was when the planet was hot. We had an atmosphere that was totally different from now. It was full of ammonia and nitrogen and had about 50% carbon dioxide in it. It was very hot, but that was nothing to do with the atmosphere. That was due to the cooling rocks. And there was one day, about 4,000 million years ago, but we do know it was a Thursday, when something happened, and something really incredible happened. It rained. It was the first time on planet Earth that we got rain. And as soon as we had liquid water on the surface of the Earth, what do you think happened? We got life. And that's why we're so confident that we'll find life, or fossil life, on Mars and elsewhere in the solar system. And then these pools of water got vaporised because we got hit by asteroids. And eventually, the rate of asteroid hitting decreased. We only now get about 80,000 tonnes of material from out there that drops on us every year. And then we had water in which we had primitive life. Now that primitive life is still with us. And I look around here and I can see a lot. That primitive life we've got in our life. That primitive life has survived for 4,000 million years. Now that's incredible. And that life is exactly what you've got. It's DNA. And that primitive life was quite happy to be in an atmosphere that was full of carbon dioxide, full of ammonia, full of nitrogen, full of sulfur gases, and it survived. There was no problem. And then, again, incredibly, on a Thursday, we had another remarkable and irreversible event. What that is? We had another incredible and irreversible event.
You actually didn't need it.
There you go.
And that was that the oceans rusted. They've only rusted once. Well, once at a major scale. And again, this was an incredible and irreversible event. And this is when this primitive form of bacterial life suddenly was a beneficiary of a climate change. And that climate change was a snowball Earth. We had the planet covered by ice from the equators to the poles. And when that ice melted, we washed out very fine particles into the ocean. Now, we have no idea how this ice age started. We have no idea how it finished. And if you think you can work out why climate changed today, then you should add ice blocks to your drinks. Because there is no way we understand the greatest climate changes on planet Earth. But when we washed out these little particles into the ocean, bacteria there, and bacteria being bacteria, thought to themselves, well, gee, I'll have a bit of this. And they had all this nutrient in the ocean, and they diversified into two groups. And these two different groups then started to fight a battle. And one group of bacteria emitted a really toxic gas. And that toxic gas wiped out the bacteria that just had a cell wall, didn't have a nucleus in the middle. And that toxic gas was oxygen. And that oxygen built up in the atmosphere. We rusted the soils, they went from green to brown. You can see this in many parts of the world. We put enough oxygen in the oceans where all the iron oxide precipitated to give us the great iron ore deposits of Western Australia and elsewhere in the world. That was an irreversible event driven by climate change. So don't you dare call me a climate denier if you haven't got a clue. And after that, we had an amazing period of time on planet Earth where very little happened. It was only for about 1 billion years, but very little happened. And we didn't see evidence of that. In the Northern Territory, we've got rocks that are 2 billion years old at a flat line. They've never been compressed and bent. They've never been cooked up. And they've got fossil bacteria in them. And then the same thing happened again. Again on a Thursday. It was just amazing. It's named after Thor, the god of thunder, so that's the obvious day for it. We suddenly came into an ice age. And we know when this ice age occurred, it was 800 million years ago. And what we also know is that the atmosphere had 20% carbon dioxide in it. How the hell does that happen? I mean, surely this gas makes us fry and die. But 20% carbon dioxide, and we had this ice age. And we see this very well in Western New South Wales, in the Flinders Ranges, in the McDonnell Ranges. We see it as a worldwide ice age. But what's even more interesting is that the material left behind as the ice retreated and expanded and retreated, these were gravels and mud and sand where the ice moves across the surface, picks up boulders and rolls them along, picks up soils, and then it retreats and leaves that there. Now, the magnetic field here in Sydney is like this, pointing to the south. At the equator, it's like that, and at the poles, it's like that. So, what do? We go and measure the magnetic field in these 800 million year old glacial rocks. And of course the ice age, the magnetic field is going to be like that. It isn't. It's that. So we had at least 20 kilometres of ice at sea level at the equator. So tell me about climate change. It just pales into insignificance. Now, we don't know why Snowball Earth started. And we don't know why it finished. But what we do know is that when it finished, I think it was a Monday, 650 million years ago, what happened was that life expanded. Why? Because we filled the oceans with all these nutrient particles. And the bacteria said, beauty, I'll have a bit of this. And they started to compete. And we actually had reefs form. Don't tell me about reefs, like the coral reef of the Great Barrier Reef. We've had reefs on planet Earth for only 3,500 million years. And these first reefs formed with coral in them 650 million years ago. We can see them. It's in a place called Arkarula. You should go there in the far north Flinders Range. It's a wonderful wilderness sanctuary. By the way, it's been run by a family for 50 years. No government support, no nothing. And they have preserved the flora and fauna better than any government national park. So the Arkarula Reef is telling us we've had a massive ice age. Suddenly there's a reef with coral in it. Then, blow me down, that ice age came back again. What happened to the reef? It died. And we had another great ice age at about 630 million years ago. And that ice age, we don't know why it started, we don't know why it finished, but when it finished, we again filled the oceans with nutrients. And these nutrients then allowed life to expand again. And again, we got our second attempt at multicellular life. The first attempt was a failure. The second one gave us the Ediacaran fauna. And this was discovered by Reg Sprigg, who actually founded the Arkarula Wilderness Sanctuary. And this was the complex life that we now have on Earth. And some of that Ediacaran fauna, they had backbones, they were soft-bodied organisms, they ate up all the bacteria. The seafloor then had a mat of bacteria. What was that driven by? Climate change. And then from then on, we've had 5 great periods of extinction and 5 great ice ages. So after that, we suddenly had another ice age, only a small one. And then after that, immediately after that climate change, what do we have? We had vegetation on the surface of the planet. So each time you see a big evolutionary change on planet Earth, it's actually driven by climate. Climate change is bloody well good for you. Just look at the history of the planet. And after that, we then had a mass extinction. Now, that mass extinction was when we were sprayed with asteroids. And we wiped out only about 76% of life. And one of the points I make in this book is that people are saying, oh, we're in the 6th great mass extinction. Absolute codswallop. A mass extinction, you wipe out more than 70% of life. Most of the life you wipe out is shallow marine life. We still have not seen evidence, while humans have been on Earth, of any shallow marine life that's been wiped out. Yes, we wiped out some big critters on the continents, but if you're a terrestrial mammal like you are going to have a very short life. You're going to be extinct very soon, or you'll mutate. And if you're a vegetarian, I'm sorry, but the fossil record shows that vegetarians are the first to go. If you're a carnivore, you're going to make it. And we also see that there's a lot of environment, and diet is only one factor. So we have come from another hormone species, we'll mutate into another one, and more about that later. So we see these mass extinctions appear a number of times. Another great mass extinction about 360 million years ago was again where we got sprayed with asteroids. We rattled the Earth so much. We had massive volcanoes. These asteroids hit Sweden, and you know, if you want to wipe out parts of the world, you want to hit boring countries. And Sweden got vaporised, which was a good thing. And then we got covered with great tsunamis, and we had volcanoes all over the Earth. When you rattle the Earth, things happen. And then we came back into a period when it was warm, and then we had a natural cooling. And that was about 270 million years ago. And here in Sydney, we were actually at the South Pole. And we were covered in ice. And what happened is when you get cold climates, you actually get peat form, which gets compressed into brown coal and gets compressed into black coal. You don't get coal in steamy Amazonian type jungles, you get into cold climates. Just go to the Nordic countries, go to Ireland, go to Scotland, that's where you get peat. So we were here in Sydney at the South Pole, and it was cold. Well, that's obviously what you expect. Well, no, obviously it's the wrong way. And then there was an extraordinary event happened. On a Thursday, 251.2 million years ago, and we had a massive asteroid hit the planet. and it hit Siberia, rattled it so much that we had massive volcanoes in Siberia that leaked out sulfur gases into the atmosphere, killed off the vegetation, and we had a mass extinction. Now that wasn't a mass extinction, it was a mass extinction. We lost 96% of all complex life on Earth, and we rebounded. Quite normal. You know, just enjoy life because you're going to become extinct. Enjoy it because mass extinctions are quite normal. After that mass extinction, we came into a much warmer climate, and here in Australia, we then suffered another mass extinction. And this is when North America got sprayed with asteroids. At the same time, we opened up the Atlantic Ocean. You can join South America and Africa together. We opened up the Atlantic. We had massive amounts of carbon dioxide come from deep down in the Earth into the atmosphere. This is quite normal. We have 1,800 volcanoes that we see on planet Earth leaking out carbon dioxide. Yet we've got 3.5 million of them underwater, none of which are measured, none of which we have much knowledge about, but we know from chemistry that these are leaking out carbon dioxide. This dissolves in seawater, and it stays there until the seawater comes to the surface and leaks out carbon dioxide. So we see the opening and closing of oceans changes the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This mass extinction, the last one I mentioned, 217 million years ago, here we were in Australia. It was nice and warm. It was tropical. Yet we were at the South Pole. So again, tell me about climate change. And we stayed at the South Pole until about 120 million years ago. And we had the good sense to start to move northwards. And we lost India, it moved off and collided with Asia and gave us the mountains. We lost New Zealand, and that's a blessing. And we pushed them out to the east and gave them their well-deserved earthquakes and volcanoes. And the only way we'll ever win the Bledisloe Cup is for a super volcano again to take place in New Zealand. And this has stressed me badly, so I'm going to have a drink. And we had another minor mass extinction about 90 million years ago. And 65 million years ago, we had another great event. This is the one you know about. This is when an asteroid was heading for planet Earth, and it had written on it, dead dinosaur. And this was the asteroid that missed Texas and actually hit Mexico. And we had massive plume of sulfur gases come into the atmosphere, kill off all the plants, the dinosaurs coughed themselves to death and died. And that's the story you know. That's probably not right. And that story is the settlement of science. However, new work has shown that the dinosaurs lived after that impact, and it might have been the massive volcanoes in India giving us the Deccan tracts, or the plateau country in India, that pumped out all these sulfur gases into the atmosphere, and the dinosaurs coughed and choked themselves to death 300,000 years after this asteroid impact in Mexico. So the whole concept of settled science doesn't work, especially if you collect data and if you get new data and with more accuracy you keep analysing it. And 65 million years ago, we came into a period of time which was warm and it was wet, and we were still moving northwards at about that much a year. We still are moving that far much a year northwards, giving Indonesia its earthquakes and volcanoes, giving the stresses in inland Australia where we get decent earthquakes every now and then, and the rising of mountains like the Great Divide, the sinking of terrain like Lake Eyre. And some 34 million years ago, South America finally decided to separate from the continent of Antarctica. And Antarctica then was set up as a polar continent. It had a circumpolar current, and that stopped warm seawater coming to Antarctica. So what did it do? It froze. That was the beginning of the Ice Age. We are still in an Ice Age. And this Ice Age, we get fluctuation between periods of warming, the interglacials, and periods of cooling, the glaciation. We're actually living in an Ice Age. For 80% of time, it's been warmer and wetter than now.
what does life like? It likes it warm and wet. And when we look at the fossil record, every time it's been warm and wet, or every time we've had a high carbon dioxide content in the atmosphere, life just takes off. It's the exact inverse of what we've been told. And some 20 million years ago, we had a shift in the ocean currents, probably due to increase in the ice mass on the pole and changing the orbit of the planet a little bit. And it became warm. Melbourne was actually tropical, and they bloody well need it. I've lived there 3 times in my life. They need a bit of tropical weather there. And it was tropical for about 3 or 4 million years. We see that in inland Australia. We see fossils, broad-leaf fossils, and a huge species diversity, typical of tropical times. And we kept cooling and kept cooling and kept cooling until about 6 million years ago. And about 6 million years ago, we cooled so much that the slight wobbles in the Earth's orbit, and it wobbles every 100,000 years, every 41,000 years, every 23,000 years. Each one of these wobbles gets us a little bit further away from the sun, and we come back again. They then started to play a part when we started to really cool down. And what happened? We went from having forests to having grasslands. You primates that lived in the forest, you had 2 possibilities. One was you could become extinct, or the second is you could walk. And we know you walked from the hip structure. We know you walked from the fossil footprints that we found. And so every time we went in the cooling phase, we, thanks be to the Lord, wiped out the vegetarians and the vegans. I love vegetarians. I eat them quite regularly. They're called beef and lamb. But we had a significant current of humans, and every time it got cold, we wiped out the mob of our people who were muesli munchers, and we lost them. Except we had an exceptionally cold period of time, and this was 2.5 million years ago. 2.5 million years ago, South America joined with North America, glued on by volcanoes in the Panama. Coincidentally, we had a supernoval explosion, pumping it with radiation, and that radiation builds up clouds. So we stopped transferring the heat between the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. We had a lot of cloud and we cooled down, and we suddenly had a cooling event. And what happened is you humans speciated. You went into species that became extinct, and you, Homo, appeared. And Homo habilis then had enough brain power to be able to invent tools and to invent fire. And we know that because the old codgers like me that had broken bones that you could see had been fed. So they must have been very efficient hunters, and they must have been able to have an excess of food. We also know from the fossil structures, from the larynx structure and the Broca's area in the brain, that these humans could talk. Now, they probably had the vocabulary of a rugby league footballer. And that was driven by climate change. And that climate change ends up in you. And we had these fluctuations in climate going in these cycles based on the Earth's orbit. And the last interglacial was between 116,000 and 128,000 years ago. Sea level was 7 metres higher than now. These are the sea sands that we've mined for beach sand mining. We know that the sea level goes up and down by enormous amounts. We know the land goes up and down. Why do you think you've got rock platforms here? Why do you think you've got places like Long Reef? That's because the land has risen a little bit. Why do you think you've got Sydney Harbour? Because it had a drowning of a river system. Sea level goes up and down. Land level goes up and down. And when some clown talks about sea level rise, the obvious thing to come back to them with is saying, well, what was the land level rise doing? Because we know that land level rises and falls very quickly. The ancient Roman city of Ephesus, mentioned in the Bible, Ephesus was a port. Now, Ephesus is 15 kilometres inland, and it's way above sea level. The city of Lydia, where gold coinage was first invented. I've been down the main street of Lydia in a yacht. down there. You can see it's a couple of metres down. So land level goes up and down very, very quickly, as does sea level. And in most cases, the sea level changes are related to temperature or expansion of the oceans, but in many cases they're not. So when some clown talks about sea level change, pull them up on land level change. And we see that in the interglacial 120 or so thousand years ago. Sea level was much higher. It was only 5 degrees warmer than now, yet the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere was lower. So there is no correlation. And if there's no correlation, forget it. It's a total furphy. And then we started to have cooling, an orbitally driven cooling. Then we start to cool and cool and cool from 116,000 years ago. And this was exacerbated by the supervolcano of Toba in Indonesia. Now, any normal volcanic eruption like Pinatubo or Krakatoa or the ones in the Mediterranean, they will bang out about 30 cubic kilometres of dust in the atmosphere. And that's just a normal volcanic eruption. You'll have a couple of years of cooling, aerosols, dust, people cough themselves to death, but you know, that's part of Darwinism, just get rid of those who cough and die. I shouldn't say that, I was but Toba put out 3,000 cubic kilometres of aerosols. We've had similar volcanoes in Yellowstone put out 10,000 cubic kilometres of aerosols, the same as those at Taupo. And coming back to the Bledisloe Cup, the only way we're going to win it is to have Taupo erupt again and just wipe out all of New Zealand, because we've got no chance. And what happened with Toba is the tropical population headed for the hills. They went north and south. That's when we got the first invasion of Australia. And that was associated with a dirty big volcanic eruption. They left the tropical climate to come into an arid climate. We very nearly died. We had, in the last interglacial, we had human species of Homo sapiens, although I've always worried about the sapiens bit. We had Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthals. We had the Florensis, the hobbits from Indonesia, you know, the dwarf throne candidates. And we had Homo habilis, handyman. Homo erectus, upright human. We had 4 humans. And by the time Toba erupted, we'd lost 3 of them, and the 4th one, us, we were really struggling. We probably went down to about 8,000 humans then, and that was a critical period of time. And we stayed cool. The zenith of the last glaciation was about 20,000 years ago. And that's when we had Scandinavia covered by 5 kilometres of ice. The weight of the ice pushed down Scandinavia. The ice is gone, Scandinavia is rising. So tell me about sea level change. Scandinavia has risen only 340 metres in the last 12,000 years. I've been to the castle of Turku in southern Finland. That was a castle built out in the Gulf of Bothnia to defend Finland against the Swedes. You can now walk to it. It's only about 7 metres above sea level, but you can walk to it. So the land level has been rising. We know that because the kings of the kings of Finland surveyed property, beachfront property, only to tax people more. And what happened was, as the land was rising, these properties were getting bigger. We've got really good survey records of this. So land goes up and down very easily. And we started to see the appearance. Some 14,700 years ago, the ice sheet started to melt. They started to dribble water into the oceans, sea level started to rise, and all of a sudden we got surges of ice. This is probably associated with the breaking of big glacial dams. And we filled the oceans with cold, fresh water, which sat on the top of the warmer salt water. And we suddenly got cold. One of these periods was called the Younger Dryas. It took only 20 years for temperatures to drop by 15 degrees Celsius. So are you really worried about a 0.6 or 0.7 degrees Celsius rise in the last 100 years? Come on, get a life. Yeah. And that happened not only once, but it happened twice. But the first great cold period in the Younger Dryas, we humans got started. And we invented animal husbandry. We invented growing crops. rather than going out and collecting grass and leafy wood. And that really pushed us. And throughout human history, we see great inventiveness coming when it was very cold. We were forced to be smart. Had another warm period, then we had another cold period. That cold period was again the breaching of some glacial lakes, probably in Canada. And then we had a remarkable event, one which I've spent a little bit of my time dealing with, and this was the Great Flood of Noah. And this actually happened. And it happened because we kept filling the oceans with meltwaters, and the Marmara Sea was up here, and the Black Sea Basin, which was grasslands, was here. The North Anatolian Fault moved, as it does every 300 years or so. On it went, and we cut out the Bosphorus, with the water pouring in from the Marmara Sea into the Black Sea. Populations dispersed. They carried with them many of their technological feats, plus their language. It was a maternal society then, and many of the words we see in the populations around there are the common words. This was the Epic of Gilgamesh myth. This was a myth of Noah and his ark. That happened. Why did it happen? Because of climate change. And then it warmed up again. And the maximum warmth we had in our current interglacial was about 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. And that period of time is called the Holocene optimum. Sea level was 1 to 3 metres higher than now. Temperatures were a couple of degrees Celsius warmer than now. And we thrive. And we keep going through these cyclical climates, through periods where the Minoan times were warm, the Egyptian times were both warm and cold. We came into the Roman times, and we look at how the Romans were dressed. They were scantily clad. Now, it could have been due to the warm climates. It could have been them going to an orgy. Who knows? But best of luck. But we have very good Roman records where they kept records of harvests and kept records of where they grew crops. They grew olives right up the Rhine Valley in Germany. They grew wine grapes in Yorkshire. Now, you can't do that now. That was warm. And then we dropped again. These cyclical changes, and the very small cyclical changes are probably related to the sun, the big ones are related to orbit. We dropped into the Dark Ages. And these were the Dark Ages. We had 3 dirty big volcanoes erupt in 545 and 546 AD. We had a solar minimum, and we had the atmosphere full of dust. It reflected light and heat. It was cold. It was called the Dark Ages because it was bloody well dark, and it was cold. And we bounced out of that period of time when there was a plague, where we had massive depopulation, where we had a loss of wealth. We bounced out of that about 900 AD, driven by the sun, into the medieval war. And the first to feel it were the Vikings. And we know that because the Vikings have got records of growing wheat and barley in Greenland. You couldn't do it now. We have records of graves, 6-foot-deep graves. You couldn't do it now because of the permafrost. The Vikings then went foraging, fishing, went to Newfoundland. They actually went into the Mediterranean. The Vikings actually spread a great distance. And then that period of warming, the medieval warming, when we had so much wealth from wonderful crops, that we could build our monasteries, our churches, our cathedrals, our universities. And in 23 years, between about 1280 and 1303, it just suddenly dropped. The Gulf of Bothnia froze, and it froze many times. We had massive cold periods. We had starvation, we had famine. The weakened population got hit by the plague in 1347. And we had super cold periods when the sun was really inactive. The last super cold period was 330 years ago, the Maud Amendment. And we've been warming over the last 330 years. So if someone says, well, this is the hottest day we've ever had, you can argue on many bases. How do you measure it? How have you doctored the measurements? But don't you expect that after 330 years of warming, you expect the most recent warming to be the warmest period of time? That's exactly the period we're in. And then we started to measure temperature with thermometers. Now in England they did it much earlier, but the international record started about 1850. And we had a wonderful period when it was warm and wet. And this is when parts of outback Australia were settled. And then we had a massive cold, dry period. Droughts occur when it's cold, not when it's warm. And that cold period wiped out a lot of the farmers in inland Australia. You've only got to travel through outback South Australia and see all these abandoned towns like Farina, abandoned houses because it was cold and people got wiped out. Then it warmed up again. Then it cooled down again. Then it warmed up again. And in the last 20 years, we've had no warming and no cooling. So if you want to call me a climate denier, I can argue very, very strongly from evidence. And what we're dealing with in dealing with climate change is that people are not prepared to look at evidence which is repeatable and which is validated. They use models. Now, the models told us we're going to fry and die. That hasn't happened. And there was a pause. We've had a pause for 20 years of no temperature rise. No model predicted that. You run a model backwards, it won't tell you what's happened. The models are telling us that we're going to fry and die. Well, sorry folks, we humans have learnt to adapt. We live on the ice sheets, we live at sea level, we live in the mountains, we live in the tropics, we live in the deserts. We can adapt. The models are telling us that, we're going to get no rainfall. Flim Flannery is a good example of that. And what's happened? Well, climate is a long-term phenomenon within which we have weather. And the weather has changed and these empty dams have filled. The models have told us that above the equator, that 12 kilometres above the equator, we're going to have a hot spot in the atmosphere. Not there. We've only had 30 million balloons go up through that patch of the atmosphere. Hasn't been found. Every day there are a few jets measuring temperature that go through that part of the atmosphere. It's not there. So the models have failed. And they've failed monumentally. There's this lady from the ANU the other day claiming that Melbourne and Sydney could have summers of 15 degrees Celsius based on our models. Operative words, model and could. Now, she must be suffering attention deficit disorder to come up with that sort of codball. The models have not worked. And much of the scares that we have been given have been about carbon pollution. Now, carbon is black, or the other form of carbon is diamond. If it's carbon pollution, you couldn't see because the atmosphere would be full, it'd be black. Or if you had carbon pollution with diamonds there, it's a case of Lucy in the sky with diamonds. You know, everything would be sparkling. And you'd probably be wanting to have another drink. So, what is really being said is that we are totally ignorant. It's not carbon pollution, it's carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a natural gas. If we halved the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we would have no vegetation. It is the food of life. It's plant food. It's the first thing you should learn in science, which you don't now at school. You learn that carbon dioxide is a killer, rather than being the basis of photosynthesis. We hear about sea levels rising and falling. Well, we've been through that. Sea levels up and down like a yo-yo, as is the land level, and you can't measure sea level unless you look at the land levels. We hear about ocean acidification. That is fraud. For 4,557 million years, the oceans on planet Earth have been alkaline, and for a very good and basic reason of chemistry, it's called buffering. And we have chemicals dissolved in seawater that stop the ocean becoming acid, and the ocean water circulates through the rocks underneath the oceans. Chemical reactions take place and you keep the oceans alkaline. If we'd ever had acid oceans, we would have seen it when we had high carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in the past. And we'd have no fossils because the shells would have been dissolved. So it's total and absolute codswallop. We hear about extinctions. Well, we're not in the sixth great mass extinction. We have a normal turnover species, and as I show in this book, the huge diversification of life that we've had in the last 200 million years has given us something quite unusual. You will never hear this in the ABC. We're actually creating new species right now. We humans are creating new species just by the environment that we live in. So, again, another further. We hear about reefs, how we're killing the Great Barrier Reef. Well, I'm sorry, but we've had reefs for 3,500 million years on the planet. And every time it cools down, you'll kill a reef. Every time it warms up, it'll come again. If it cools down, as it will inevitably happen, unless you can change the Earth's orbit and the sun, we will wipe out the Great Barrier Reef. It'll move further to the east, and it'll move further to the north. It'll come back again. And all the studies of the reef show this. And all the studies of reefs in the fossil record show that, yes, they are attacked by predators. Yes, they are fighting to survive. Yes, they do get swamped by sediment. Yes, they get destroyed by intense weather. But coral is incredibly resilient. It's been on planet Earth for 650 million years, and it's survived more than we humans can throw at it. We hear stories about the polar ice. The poles melted, we're dying. What we don't hear is that there are more than 150 volcanoes underneath the Antarctic ice. And these volcanoes are heating up the ice, and the rocks are hot. Now what do you think's going to happen to the ice? It's going to melt. And we never hear anything about that. We don't hear of the cycles that we see in the Arctic ice. The Arctic area has been a little bit warm lately, but it was warm in the mid-50s. And that's when a US nuclear submarine could surface at the North Pole. We saw that before with the Norwegian explorers. We could see that we have these cycles of warming and cooling. And these ocean cycles are very well recorded. We hear about extreme temperatures. Well, here we've got a little problem, because temperature measurements 100 years ago were by thermometer with an order of accuracy about plus or minus 0.5 degrees Celsius. You're telling me we've had a ½ degree Celsius rise in temperature. That is in the order of accuracy. It's a totally meaningless scientific measurement. And the second thing is that temperature measurements globally are homogenised. That is the euphemism for fraud. And this is where temperature measurements have been adjusted. So we've got many temperature measuring stations in Australia with a century measurement where temperature's been going down. They've been adjusted to show the temperature's going up. And in fact, the temperature record, as some of the climatologists are telling us, is nigh on useless. We can get very, very little from it. We hear about droughts. The biggest droughts we've ever had on planet Earth are when it's been cold. And every time we see a glacial sequence in the rock, we see what are called red beds. These are old dune sands. We see old salt deposits. So don't tell me about climate change in human times. And just to finish off on a few points in this book, I open with saying you couldn't make this up if you tried. Here we are in a country that's exporting huge amounts of coal. We have 30% of the world's uranium. We're exporting 8,000 tonnes of uranium and yellowcake. We're exporting huge amounts of gas. Yet we have unreliable and horrendously expensive electricity. Why has that happened? Because governments have put their beak into the free market. And that happened in late 1998, early 1999, and we've had we've had electricity price decreases from 1955, and as soon as the federal government put its nose in, the price went up. It went up even more and at an even greater rate in 2005 when we started to subsidise wind and solar, subsidise these burden-back chomping turbines that emit more carbon dioxide than they ever save by building them. They have to have a coal-fired power station ticking over at the same time. So we have had a situation where we've had government interference in the generation of electricity, and rather than using power engineers, we've had green ideologues and, excuse the tautology, dumb politicians who've put their nose into the market. And why have they done it? They've done it because they wanted to reduce emissions. Now, emissions of carbon dioxide are what they're referring to. we can argue very strongly that human emissions of carbon dioxide do not drive global warming. 97% of all emissions, natural emissions, are 97%. 3% is from humans. So you're trying to tell me that 3% of the annual emissions of carbon dioxide drive global warming, the 97% of natural emissions don't. Well, pull the other one. And that is the fallacy of the whole global warming scare, that is based on a fallacy. It's then been exacerbated with fraud by fools, and we're ending up paying a huge amount of money for our electricity because we built these allegedly low emissions, wind, bird chomping and bat chomping turbines, where they emit huge amounts of carbon dioxide to build them and maintain them, and you've still got to have a coal-fired power station sticking out. It just doesn't add up. Not only do we subsidise these, but we have a must-take policy. And so if they generate some electricity, the community must take that electricity. And you can't have coal-fired power stations fired up and fired back and fired up depending on the weather. Coal-fired stations take 24 hours to rev up, and you can't turn it on and off. So it's no wonder they're going broke. It's been a deliberate policy to drive the stable, cheap electricity into bankruptcy, and to be able to have the carpetbaggers in there dealing with a market where electricity fluctuates enormously. Now, I haven't been born and bred in Sydney, but I currently live in South Australia. I've solved the problem. I've just bought a 7.5 kVA generator. The problem. It cost me 65 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity. It runs on diesel, and power and electricity in South Australia is now the highest in the world. It's 48 cents a kilowatt hour, and increasing. Well, that's just bizarre. It's absolutely bizarre. So here we have in Australia, it's an energy-rich country, through appalling political policy by all parties, no parties led office, wanting to appeal to be wonderfully soft and green. Now, no Greens get a vote for the National Party, no Greens get a vote for the Libs. Why bother with them? Or pay our bills, yes. So what we've now got is a situation of massive self-interest. And if there's a hint of decreasing subsidies for wind and solar power, you just listen to the self-interested organisations, AGL and others, who will make a huge amount of noise. So we're living in a period of absolute madness, and to conclude, there are some simple solutions, and I've got a few of them in here. The first is to kill off any RET, kill off any subsidies, kill off any climate institutes, kill off any charitable status for these feral activist groups like Greenpeace. Don't worry about the Paris Agreement because no one else does. And continue to generate the bulk of our power from coal, and to make sure that those who are trying to moralise and control our lives live by the same laws we have to live by. If you as a company director tell a porky pie, you go to jail. Why shouldn't the political activists? Why shouldn't the Greenie? Why shouldn't the unions? If you, as a company director, say, oh, bloody hell, we've made a loss this year, let's homogenise the results. Any report and put
Fill all the books.
You go to jail. And it doesn't happen with the Bureau of Meteorology, it doesn't happen with the Met Office in the UK, it doesn't happen worldwide. So, in effect, we are going to need some political leadership, which unfortunately we don't have. Now, I make a prediction. I'm not in making predictions as I've criticised models, but I'll make a prediction. People are now starting to get a bit concerned about the inordinate cost of electricity. Just wait till it's unreliable. And just wait till we've had 3 years of Bill Shorten with the Prime Monster, and then we will get a political change. But I do not see us getting a change until it gets far, far worse than that. We have set policies here with a country that once had cheap electricity. It was once reliable. And cheap electricity drives jobs, it drives employment, and it drives the whole community. we have destroyed that, and we've destroyed it on an ideology that's unfounded. And I come back to the original question that I ask a number of times in this book. Can you please show me that the human emissions of carbon dioxide drive global warming? Now, I've been a scientist for 50 years. I'm very much aware of scientific tricks and games and fraud and peer review and all this sort of stuff, but no one has yet shown that the human emissions of carbon dioxide drive global warming. So if the very foundation doesn't exist, then the whole lot is a pack of cards, a deck of cards, and it'll fall over. But there's going to be a huge amount of pain before it happens. I just hope that with the amount of body abuse that I give myself, that I'm going to live long enough to see the change. But I think we have to be in there constantly reminding people, can you please show me that the human emissions of carbon dioxide drive global warming? Very simple question. Now, the normal answer is you get abused. And that is saying, well, I'm sorry, but I have no evidence to argue against. And that's what we're up against. We're up against the deconstruction of Western civilization, up against that great rationality and logic which has built society. We're up against knowledge, which is now dismissed. The great institutions of society, like the churches, like the institutions, like politics, have been destroyed in a deconstruction, yet nothing better has been put in its place. So I think we have a duty to fight, and to fight hard and be totally unafraid, because the bullets are only rubber bullets. Don't worry about it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor. We're going to take only a couple, maybe half a dozen questions max, right? Then you can go home. I do just want to say that I'm absolutely delighted that Sarah, the wife of my Outsiders co-host, Rowan Dean, has arrived at the back of the room. There, Sarah, it's terrific to see you. Good you were able to get Rowan out of rehab for the meeting tonight. We appreciate that. Rowan and I never ever announce who our mystery outsider is going to be on the weekend coming up. So whatever you do, make sure you do not tell anyone that Ian Plimer is our guest this weekend, because that is top secret. And the only other two slightly self-indulgent thing I'm going to tell you is that last Sunday, Outsiders rated, I think, well, almost double our next nearest competitor of the content screened by Sky over the weekend in ratings. And there is a power in people turning up, you know, people watching. I think we've only got, can I tell you, there is a power. One of the reasons why Ian Plimer succeeds is because he does actually sell books. Lots and lots of, you know, Bill Shorten, according to Troy Bramston, how many books what's the most number of books you've sold?
About 150,000 books for Heaven and Earth.
150,000 books for Heaven and Earth. Bill Shorten's book, according to Troy Bramston, has sold 1,700 copies. And most of them were handed out in the Christmas stockings of AWU members by Caesar Mellon, in between writing out invoices for back pain injury. But anyway, can I tell you, I had to read the book in a hurry to have read it before I got here tonight. It is a book you can have beside your bed and read it at leisure, getting inside the mind of a bloke who has spent his life thinking and studying and seeking to understand our Earth, our universe, our geology, our atmosphere. And I just think this is one of the unbelievable, the fact that you can buy Socrates, you know, for $20, right? There will presumably be a range of bookstores around Sydney who have got, who will not stock this. Those bookstores who've got a kind of rectal dysfunction, you know, where they've got a corn cob shoved up their asses, so they won't show books that don't agree with, you know, Hartog's, Glee books. You know. We're really stupid. We wish to deny ourselves sources of opinion. That's how stupid we are. Anyway, sorry. We're going to take a maximum of 6 questions. So we'll just go to the chambray blue shirt there. First hand up. Go ahead, sir.
So we've seen Malcolm just starting to jump onto the winning team a little bit, not very strongly, but we've seen him saying things like we need to contemplate coal-fired power stations. And we've seen him having general polite discussions with gas companies. So he's going probably, 1% of the way that he should be going. But in the background, these backbenchers, there are some very sensible backbenchers amongst the Liberals, and I think some of the National members are as well. How do we get those people to actually have the power in the party rather than the ones that have control at the moment?
We can't, it's too early yet. The same mob that put us in this crisis are telling us they can get us out of it. You've got to be joking. The discussions about gas are a total diversion, and the gas policies in Victoria were actually started by the National Party holding hands with Lock the Gate, and then getting the Nationals and Libs putting on a moratorium, and then Labor followed it. It's bizarre. It's a state short of gas, 2 big basins. We've got gas processing plants and pipelines going across these basins. We know that in the Otway Basin there's a 2,500 metre section of gas-bearing rocks, and you're not allowed to drill for them. So all parties are to blame. I think we have a Labor light in our current government, and there are self-interests there. The Financial Review has written about Mr Turnbull's son Alex, and his interests in the renewable energy industry, and I think we've got to have a lot more pain before there's going to be anything that will happen. I'm not advocating that we're going to have a revolution, but people have got to really hurt. If people die on the operating table, people like you and me, no one cares, but if we've got little kids on the operating table, then there will be a storm. So it's got to get a lot worse before it gets better, which is why I'm suggesting we have 3 years of Mr Shorten as the Prime Minister, and then we might get a chance.
Can I just say, we had John Ruddock, I don't think he's still with us. John Ruddock is the democracy campaigner in the Liberal Party. He was here for the presentation. One answer to your question is there is a genuine attempt to try and reform the New South Wales division of the Liberal Party, to put its power into the hands of members instead of factional delegates and lobbyists. That will go some distance towards recruiting more natural candidates who are of the people and for the people, instead of sort of factional hacks and flacks incorporated, where you wind up with a party led by Malcolm and Lucy from inside this little hermetically sealed bubble of eastern suburbs correctness. Who did we have? Yes, sir.
Yeah, Professor Pilsener. I've known him for 25 years. I was in the South Australian outback last year when the power went off for 3 days. It's not just that you lose electricity, you lose water because the pumps don't work, petrol because the pumps don't work, telephone, cell phone. You're really living in a third world country. Their solution is a $100 million battery. My question is, how much energy is going to go into the manufacture and maintenance of that battery, which apparently will keep the lights on for about 2 minutes?
Richard, there is a massive amount of energy to go into making lithium. The copper that is absolutely vital for these batteries. And these are marketed by a chap whose name is like a deodorant. And if all of South Australia needs those batteries in a massive blackout, which it's had before, you've got 4.5 minutes to make yourself a cup of coffee, and that's it. Now, to add to that, South Australia is spending a huge amount of money putting in diesel generators as backup. Now, just when you burn a hydrocarbon like diesel, don't you emit carbon dioxide?
Yeah.
So the whole thing is absolutely nonsensical. To make it even worse, they quite deliberately dynamited a power station which had been going for a long time, put in by Sir Thomas Playford, using 13,000 tonnes a day that came down from Copley through Lee Creek down to the power station. Now they've got themselves a problem. They've blasted this power station into nothing. They've got this railway line that goes to nowhere. And the poor old South Australian government have got the town of Lee Creek. And they're wondering what to do with a vacant town. I mean, come on. It is absolute madness. Now, go and check the South Australian Liberals policy. There are some really, really important points of policy there. One is that they're advocating that at a red light we can turn left without waiting for the light to change. Now that's going to change the nation. They want a ban on fracking and drilling for gas in the Otway Basin in South Australia, and they want no nuclear. Now this is total madness. Your name lead. If you have uranium naturally decay, you end up with 2 isotopes of your name. Another one is artificial, which is quite appropriate for you. The other one's stable, which I'm not so sure you are. But we have in South Australia 30% of the world's uranium. Why in the hell can't you build a reactor? Now, I've argued in this book that the best reactors to get would get you away from all the design problems are the modular reactors. You can go down to Bunnings and buy yourself a nuclear reactor. They're made by General Electric and Hitachi and POSCO. You can buy these things, put them in a mine like Carrapateena. When that's finished, put it on a B-double and take it somewhere else. And here you've got a uranium mining town of Roxby Downs. What a perfect place to put a reactor. What can be the arguments against that? You've got the high voltage power lines. Electrons don't care whether they go south or north, and put it there. You've got all these contaminated sites at Maralinga. What a wonderful place to put a reactor. You've got this power station you've dynamited. I don't know what your question was, but this is the answer. You've got this power station you've dynamited, yet you've got all the high voltage lines coming from it. Why can't you put in a modular reactor there and send the power down the line? Why can't you be really smart and put in a 2 gigawatt reactor and send it back through the interconnectors to Energy Star and Victoria? It's totally beyond me.
Pause. We're going to try and get through just 3 or 4 more. Yes, yes, sir. We're going to come down the front, but yes.
Discrimination against women.
We're coming to you next, if you behave.
So my question,
Yep.
we have the world's longest coastlines. We have coal coming out of our eyeballs. We have the 2nd largest uranium deposits in the world. We have more sun than you can take a stick at. We have geothermal opportunities. We have hydro. You'd think with all that we'd have cheap power prices. You think with all that we'd use that to our economic advantage and leverages businesses that rely on energy, like Iceland do with their aluminium and their hydro. We have the best of both worlds, renewables, and what are we doing? Why do we have these power prices, and why aren't we leveraging it to I just lose the plot.
You hit it on the head with aluminium. Where you have aluminium smelters, you've got long-term cheap power. Now, we've had aluminium smelters at Gladstone, the Hunter, got one at Portland. Why did we build this aluminium smelter at Portland way away from your lawns? And the reason is that the smelters went and said, look, we want to take bucket loads of electricity day and night, 24/7, 365 days a year. And then you could build the power stations at your lawn because you've got a guaranteed buy of your power. Then you could build your smelter because you've got a guaranteed supply of electricity. It's really simple stuff. Now, any country with aluminium smelters must have cheap power, and it must have a hell of a lot of power. We have had that, and we are destroying it. And we are destroying it on a political ideology based on the fantasy that human emissions, not any other emissions, but human emissions of carbon dioxide drive global warming. That has never been shown, and you can show the inverse. And so we have to basically ignore anything the Greens tell us and get on with creating jobs and prosperity and getting government out of the way. And I give the example in this book of the Industrial Revolution in the UK, where, if that's the press, I'm not free. No. In the UK, whereby government of that day protected people's patents. And if you invented something and it didn't work, you went broke. And if you invented something and it was terrific, you made a lot of money. And the government was then concerned with protecting your property rights, among which are patents. They were not concerned about homosexual marriage, which is abuse of a lovely word. They were not concerned about that. They were concerned about the growth of prosperity. So we have totally lost the plot, in my view. We are kowtowing to those who will never vote for us, and we have no leadership, and we have advisors who are 28-year-olds in white shoes who have been staffers all their life and have no idea. People don't, I mean, you might have called me Professor Pilsner, but I actually go to pubs and I listen to what people say in pubs. And in pubs, you get how the community is thinking. We have none of that now. Our politicians have no idea how the punters actually think.
Okay, we're going to take only 2 more questions because I know we're going to sell out these books and Anne's going to have to probably sign them. So I want to have enough time for that and for the rest of you to get home. The only thing I'm going to answer in response to your question gratuitously is when you're banging your head against the wall, looking at this abundance of energy and this ratcheting of higher, there is a moment where you realise it's actually not about rationality, you know, it's not about reason. As Ian says, it is an absolutely bloody-minded, in my opinion, vicious, intensely ideological, emotion-led campaign, which has absolutely nothing to do with reason or with climate. And it's not until you solve that riddle that the other stuff starts making sense. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for your speech, Ian. It's very, very interesting, and I'm going to look forward to reading your book. I'm also a geologist, concerned about our country. I find that most policies that our government now, it doesn't matter which party we're talking about, Liberal, Labor or Greens, seem to go against the grain, as you say, of pub politics, of what the Australian people want. A clear example, I went to Doug Cameron's talk a few weeks ago on housing. And the elephant in the room was mass immigration, 300, 200,000 people flooding into this country. Not your topic tonight, but why do you think that whichever party's in power, they seem to ignore the voice of public opinion and they seem to have their own agenda?
In terms of mass immigration, Dick Smith sent me some stuff the other day. I often argue with him about all sorts of things, but he's advocating for a 30 million maximum population here, which I think is very sensible because, as you would know, there's very little water in Australia. You can't have 100 million people.
Old people to actually survive.
Yeah.
So the first thing is that population is a problem in this country. The second thing is the main resource for the population, which is food, is a problem. The third thing is we are politically driven by people living in cities. And people that come from Sydney and go to a winery in Mudgee think that they're in the bush. Well, I can tell you that on a quiet night in Mudgee you can hear the surf. That's not outback. Outback's not 1,000 kilometres out. And claim that they're the great bronze Aussie. That's total bullshit. We live in cities. We have no idea what happens outside the city. We have no idea where our power comes from, our resources come from, our energy comes from, and this is a problem of education. And I think the only way to have that problem of education is to force it on people such that their electricity prices quadruple from now. And then they might say, oh, hang on a sec, maybe we've got a fundamental wrong. So I think we've got to have a lot more pain before rationality and logic.
Okay, we're going to take one more question. I just want to, just for the record, in the spirit of liberalism and differences of opinion, I just want to record for the record that I'm a very strong supporter of the right to turn left at traffic lights, and I hope that should be introduced as a national policy. Okay, we're going to take one final question. Yes, sir, we'll go to you at the front. I know it's discrimination on the basis of who's closer, but off you go. There's a microphone for you.
Have you done a cost-benefit analysis of the benefits of joining the Liberal Party to chuck out the traitors in order to save a good $800 a year on your energy costs?
Well, I answer that by saying the Sydney Mining Club had a function at lunchtime today, and the speaker was a former Liberal. It wasn't that he left the Liberal Party, they left him. And it was Corey Bernard. And so the cost-benefit analysis on being a member of a party or not is, I don't think that's where the pressure comes. I think the pressure comes by constantly pestering politicians. I constantly pester mine, my federal member, and I say this very quietly, but his name's Christopher Pine. I meet him all the time. And
he's not listening.
No, at any social occasion I can see him ducking for cover, climbing up the chimney and disappearing. He just doesn't want to face me. And I think what we have to do in a democratic society is to pester those people we pay. Because every couple of years they come to us and say, look, I want my job back. Well, make sure they work for it.
Well, look, I'm going to mention the fact that, because we have to talk about me a little bit more, Rowan Dean and I had a bloke named Richard Orchard on the show last week, who, as one of the outsiders, Richard is a gay man who lives with his gay partner, but they also live with Richard's ex-boyfriend. And then in the house next door is the mother of Richard's child, who lives with her girlfriend. And the thing was, Richard is a former member of the Liberal Party. And I said to him, so you're a former member, but as a gay man, you know, the New South Wales Liberal Party is quite, I thought it would have been sort of your thing. And he said, no, I've joined Corey Bernardi's Conservative Party. So there you go, he's reaching out across a broad spectrum. I would urge political activism, whether to, at the, you know, pestering your local member, or joining a political party, although I must admit I got expelled from the last one I joined. But I just think tonight I regard as a kind of a moment, you know, in the fight back. And we've had a walk through the history of our planet, which I suspect, you know, if you go through the rest of your life, the number of individuals you will meet who can give you a potted history of the Earth in, you know, 45 minutes, it's going to be a small group. It's going to be a small group. There basically is only one Ian Plimer. All of us have the opportunity. Can I just say to you, I'm genuinely enjoying the book. I can recommend it to you, not as a chore or as a duty, but as something that will powerfully enrich your mind, having fellowship with one of the very, very small number in the world who are capable of that kind of perspective, you know, from scholarship, from thought, from his own experience as a miner, as a geologist. So, ladies and gentlemen, please thank one of our greatest Australians in the
ladies and gentlemen. I will ask our Sydney representative, Jeff Grimshaw, to give the official vote of thanks. But before I do, I'd like to just throw in a quick advertorial. Up in Brisbane on Saturday week, we have what's called Liberty Fest. It's a conference that's featuring Ian Plimer, who's opening the conference with Jennifer Marahasi, which some of you would know. I know there's many people in the audience that are also attending Liberty Fest. And there's other people up there, including Latham. Ross Cameron's attending, of course, as part of the Old Outsiders. I know Rowan just left, so I can say that. Many others, Daisy Cousins, David Lionhelm's making an appearance. I'm not sure whether by that stage it'll be Senator Malcolm Roberts or Mr. Malcolm Roberts. Yeah. But if you've got an interest in climate commentary, Malcolm's certainly got something to say on that, and he'll be there as well. Many other speakers. If you're interested in making a quick flight to Brisbane, or Brisneyland as we call it, or Bris Vegas, if you're short of a good time, it's a full day, 2 nights, and you're assured of a good time. Just to close, I'll ask Jeff Grimshaw just to give the formal vote of thanks.
Well, thank you to our 2 wonderful speakers tonight, who are actually on their 2nd event of the day. This is how hard they work. On a Thursday of all days as well. And so first up we had the great Ross Cameron. Oh, there he is. The one half of the Outsiders, who seemingly now resides in the Sky News studios, where he tames the vicious creatures, the parrots, called Janine, the huge McDinwits, the other assorted sheep at the left, and then of course on Sunday mornings at 10 AM he manages to keep a leash on the mad dog, Rowan Dean. Now we do love a big eruption from Rowan Dean every now and again, and speaking of eruptions, we then had the wonderful Professor Ian Plimer, who every few years erupts like a CO2 belching volcano, with one of his wonderful books. One of his last ones was How to Get Expelled from School. I was hoping he was going to update it, but being as he wrote it 6 years ago and the number of things you can get expelled from school for these days has grown exponentially, it would have to be the size of a telephone book. Instead, he's written this wonderful new book called The Climate Change, which is actually the cooler name for global warming, Delusion, and the Great Electricity Rip-Off. Somebody once told me that you should always read the end of a book when you buy it in case you die before you get to the end. And I've actually just flipped through the last couple of pages of this book, and I don't want to spoil anything for you, but it's not CO2. What did it? It was actually Professor Plimer in the library throwing a spanner in the works of the global warming fraud. So many thanks to our 2 great speakers, and many thanks to the Metropolitan Hotel for hosting this event again, and we hope to see you all again at a LibertyWorks event. Thank you very much.
Buy some books.
Yeah, it went well.
Yes.
Really nice to meet you. I'm part of German, by the way. Mile.
Yeah. Nice to meet you. Are you staying around for a bit?
I have to find someone. Okay. But I might come back.
Sorry, no, you're right. I'm trying to get it.
Anyway, I have to tell everyone
are. We're really good at that the world's at a tipping point and it's just the end.
It's just happening to me now. That's right. Oh, God. How quick. I'm sorry.
Then I might go to the We've been talking about that over lunch. I should have worked on that.
The media is the problem. Mainstream media. So they just say dumb, mate. Just follow what you're told. Why didn't even know how they get their names. I lost that contact. All these traders go to schools and they teach things to use how to do the implement loans, how to equalise, like that. Sounds nice, and the parents are amazing bias. Even I can see that.
Come on, boss, hurry up. What are you trying to
That actually is against that because it's external by law. It's external must get the consent of parents. But without the consent of parents, and it's serious brainwashing, really every law without it, yeah, be in jail. In jail. And it's going to get worse.
Non-city traffic, money. You're a tourist. I say to tourists,
I mean, a lot of the, she's
because last year in Brisbane, it doesn't get cold.
And there's legal discrimination.
Well, that happens all the time. You can't get a job in journalism unless you're elected. So they've taken over. Unless you're really, really talented.
We And they would see us and we'd just step aside, they just drive straight through. And we would go and drive, we should go everywhere. They just go, say to Mom, and go, I'm not stopping. They just go. Back in those days,
You've got to have control over break the family, you have control over the entire race. But it's always, it gets undermined by people that might not be dead. It's about starving and Venezuela now, they're destroyed it, but they're working on to get it back again. But here we've destroyed our engineering. No roof. Well, because there's no emotion. Stress and strains, there's no emotion. There's no emotion. If you don't let them make it, you don't get the gig. It's discrimination on steroids. So it's actually thought crime. It's like we whinge about crimes gone well, and they lock up especially the nice right to make an income. That's what I think with that rally the other day.
Yeah, I've sent him the still survive this long. How long have you been a vegan? I've got a vegan.
Video where he admits this the other co-founder, Gary Dowson, obviously pedophile priest 50 years ago, while they're promoting conversions like hello, standards, smell, There will be nobody in
That's the
CC, are they? Well, right, you've got to take the average fund on it. It's all about getting the Communist China. Telephone of stuff, even if we make nothing, we're still going to do this. And that's also Nazis,
Let's read out.
It'll get better. It'll get better. I'll be able to move this.
That's the reason for my question.
I've been
If you haven't seen the court system, it's the whole lot, yeah. So there's only a handful, basically by
Advantage.